The studio lights burned bright that Tuesday afternoon, casting their familiar golden glow across the Family Feud set. Steve Harvey adjusted his charcoal suit jacket and glanced at his cards, the weight of another taping session settling into his shoulders. The audience buzzed with anticipation, their energy filling the cavernous space like electricity before a storm. It had been a long day already. This was their fourth episode of the day, and Steve could feel the familiar rhythm of television production humming around him. Camera operators adjusted their positions, sound technicians checked levels one final time, and the makeup artist had given him a final powder touch-up just moments before. But despite the routine nature of it all, Steve still felt that familiar spark of excitement every time he stepped onto this stage. "All right, folks, we got a good one today," Steve announced, his voice booming through the microphone with practiced ease. The crowd erupted in applause, their voices echoing off the studio walls adorned with the iconic blue and gold Family Feud logo. He fed off their energy, the way he always did. After all these years, the audience response still gave him that same rush he'd felt during his early days in comedy clubs. But something felt different today. Steve couldn't put his finger on it. Maybe it was the way the Martinez family stood at their podium, or the subtle tension that seemed to hover around them like morning fog. There was Maria, the mother, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a floral dress that looked carefully chosen. She kept smoothing the fabric nervously, her eyes darting between the cameras and her family members. Beside her stood Carlos, her husband, his calloused hands betraying years of construction work, dressed in his best button-down shirt. The sleeves were slightly too long, and he kept adjusting his collar as if he wasn't used to wearing formal clothing. Their teenage son, Miguel, shifted nervously, tall for his age but still carrying that awkward teenage energy, while grandmother Rosa clutched her purse with weathered fingers, a small silver crucifix visible at her throat. The opposing team, the Johnsons, stood ready at their podium, all smiles and competitive energy. They had no idea what was about to unfold. "Let me tell you something," Steve continued, walking toward the Martinez family with his characteristic swagger. "When I see families come on this show, I see love, I see unity, I see people who stick together through thick and thin." He paused, studying their faces more carefully now. There was something in Maria's eyes, a depth of sadness that seemed to live just beneath the surface, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. It was the kind of look he'd seen before, but not often, and never in this context. Something in Maria's eyes made him linger a moment longer than usual. Steve had been hosting long enough to read people, to sense the stories they carried. It was part of what made him good at this job, the ability to connect with contestants, to find that human moment that made television worth watching. But with the Martinez family, he sensed layers of story that went far deeper than the usual "we're here to win money for vacation" narrative. "Martinez family," he said, his voice carrying genuine warmth, "tell America what brings you to Family Feud today." Carlos stepped forward slightly, clearing his throat. "Well, Steve, we're from San Antonio, Texas. Been watching your show for years. My mother-in-law Rosa here. She never misses an episode. She says you remind her of her late husband. Same mustache, same big heart." The audience awed at this, and Steve grinned, walking over to Rosa and taking her weathered hand gently in his. "Rosa, you're too kind. Your husband was a lucky man." Rosa smiled, her first genuine smile since taking the stage, and patted Steve's hand. "Mijo, you bring joy to people's lives every day. That's a gift from God." Steve felt that familiar warmth spread through his chest, the reminder of why he loved this job, beyond the fame and success. It was moments like these, connecting with real people, real families, that kept him grounded. The first few rounds went smoothly. Standard questions, standard answers, standard Family Feud energy. Steve worked his magic, cracking jokes, making faces at ridiculous responses, keeping the audience laughing. The scoreboard lit up with points, buzzers sounded, and the game flowed like a well-rehearsed dance. "What do you call a person who talks too much?" Steve had asked, during round 2, and when Miguel answered, "My sister," the studio erupted in laughter. Even Maria had smiled then, a genuine moment of joy that lit up her face. Steve had high-fived the teenager, completely unaware that this would be the last moment of pure happiness for the next hour. During the commercial break before round 4, Steve noticed Maria speaking quietly with her family members. Their faces were serious, hushed. Carlos kept glancing at the cameras, then back at his wife as if weighing something heavy in his mind. Rosa crossed herself twice and whispered what looked like a prayer. "You folks doing all right over there?" Steve called out, his natural instinct to check on his contestants kicking in. "We're fine, Mr. Harvey," Carlos had replied, but his voice carried a weight that made Steve pause. "Just grateful to be here." Something in the way he said grateful stuck with Steve as they prepared for the next round. It wasn't the usual contestant excitement. It was deeper, more profound, like someone acknowledging a gift they never expected to receive. But then came round 4. "All right, Martinez family," Steve said, his voice carrying across the studio. "This question is worth double points. Here we go." He looked down at his card, and for a split second his confident expression faltered. The words on the page seemed to burn into his retinas. "We surveyed 100 people. Top 5 answers on the board. Name something your child has said to you that made your heart." The audience oohed in appreciation. It was the kind of heartwarming question that always brought out the best responses, the kind that made viewers at home smile and think of their own children. Steve looked up at Maria, expecting to see the usual mix of concentration and excitement. Instead, he saw something that made his chest tighten. Her face had gone completely white. Her hands, which had been gripping the podium edge, began to tremble almost imperceptibly. "Maria," Steve said, his voice gentler now, though he wasn't sure why. "You're playing for your family. What's something your child has said that just melted your heart?" The studio fell into an expectant hush. Cameras zoomed in. The audience leaned forward in their seats. But Maria just stood there, frozen, her lips moving soundlessly as if she were trying to form words that wouldn't come. 10 seconds passed. 20. The silence stretched like a taut wire, and Steve felt something shift in the atmosphere of the studio. This wasn't the usual contestant nervousness. This was something deeper, something raw and painful that was bleeding through the bright lights and cheerful music. "Take your time," Steve said softly, though his professional instincts told him to move things along. Something about the way Maria's shoulders had begun to shake made him stay right where he was. Then Carlos stepped forward, his work-worn hand finding his wife's shoulder. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but the studio microphones caught every word. The years of carrying this burden showed in the way his shoulders sagged, in the careful way he chose his words. "Our daughter Emily. She's been missing for 3 years." The words hit the studio like a physical blow. The audience intake of breath was audible, a collective gasp that seemed to suck all the air from the room. Steve felt his knees go weak, and for the first time in his career, he was completely speechless. In 30 years of television, through comedy specials, talk shows, and thousands of Family Feud episodes, nothing had ever stripped away his ability to speak like this moment did. The silence stretched on, and Steve could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He was dimly aware of the cameras still rolling, of the red lights that indicated they were still live, but none of that mattered now. What mattered was the family standing in front of him, carrying a weight that no family should ever have to bear. Maria's composure crumbled like a dam breaking. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, as if trying to hold back an ocean of grief that had been contained for far too long. Carlos wrapped his arm around her, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears, and Steve could see the way this man had been holding up his family for 3 long years, being their rock when their world had shattered. "She was 8, Carlos continued, his voice stronger now, as if saying the words out loud was somehow necessary, as if bearing witness to their pain might somehow make it more bearable. "Beautiful little girl with pigtails and gap teeth. She told us she loved us every single day, every single day." His voice cracked on the repetition, and Steve saw Miguel reach out to steady his father, this teenager who had been forced to grow up too fast, who had watched his parents live in a state of suspended grief for years. Steve looked down at his cards, then back at the family. The bright studio lights suddenly felt harsh. The cheerful music that had been playing softly in the background now seemed obscene. This wasn't a game show anymore. This was a moment of raw, unfiltered human pain, playing out under the unforgiving gaze of television cameras. The audience sat in stunned silence. Some women had their hands pressed to their hearts. A man in the front row removed his baseball cap, as if he were in church. The camera operators continued filming, but their usual smooth movements had stopped. Everyone seemed frozen in this moment of unexpected truth. Steve Harvey, the man who had hosted thousands of episodes, who had seen every kind of answer and every type of family, stood in the center of it all and felt something crack open inside his chest. He thought of his own children, of the countless times they had run to him with scraped knees and big dreams, of bedtime stories and morning hugs. He thought about Winton, his youngest, how he still sometimes crawled into bed during thunderstorms. He thought about his daughters, the way they used to grab his legs when he came home from work, squealing, "Daddy," with pure joy. He thought about what it would mean to have that stolen away, to wake up every morning not knowing if your child was safe, cold, hungry, or scared. The weight of that realization hit him like a physical force. "Maria," he said finally, his voice barely recognizable. He set his cards down on the podium and walked toward her, each step deliberate and purposeful. The cameras followed him, but he had forgotten about them entirely. When he reached the Martinez family, Steve did something he had never done in all his years of hosting. He left the designated host area and stepped behind their podium, into their space, into their grief. "Look at me," he said to Maria, his voice gentle but firm. She raised her eyes to meet his, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Look at me." The studio was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning system seemed deafening. 200 people holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. "You don't have to answer that question," Steve said, his own voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to do anything right now, except know that everyone in this room, everyone watching at home, everyone connected to this moment, we're all holding Emily in our hearts right now." He paused, looking out at the audience, then back at Maria. Sometimes the most beautiful answer isn't something we can put up on a board. Sometimes the most beautiful answer is the love that never stops, even when... He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Carlos squeezed his wife's hand. "She used to tell us every night before bed, 'I love you to the moon and back, and around the sun, and through all the stars,' every single night." The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't the expectant silence of a game show. It was the profound quiet of recognition, of shared humanity, of a moment when entertainment dissolved and left only truth. Steve nodded slowly. "That's the most beautiful answer I've ever heard on this show," he said simply. "And I want you to know something, Maria. Carlos. That little girl's voice, it's still echoing. It's in your hearts. It's in your son Miguel's smile. It's in grandmother Rosa's prayers. Love like that doesn't disappear. It changes form." He looked directly into the camera then, his eyes red-rimmed but steady. Folks, sometimes Family Feud isn't about the families playing the game. Sometimes it's about the family watching at home. If Emily Martinez is out there somewhere, if someone knows something, anything, please, people need their little girl to come home. The camera held on his face for a long moment, then panned to show the entire Martinez family. Miguel had moved closer to his mother. Rosa was clutching her rosary. Carlos stood like a pillar of strength, but his jaw trembled with the effort of maintaining composure. Then something extraordinary happened. Without any direction from producers or stage managers, the audience began to stand. One person, then another, then entire rows rising to their feet. It wasn't applause, it was something deeper than that. It was witness, it was solidarity, it was 200 strangers saying, without words, "We see your pain, we honor your love, we won't forget your Emily." Steve stood with the family as the audience remained on their feet, the studio lights casting long shadows across the stage. The game board behind them still showed the unanswered question, but no one was looking at it anymore. "We're going to take a break," Steve announced to the cameras, though his voice was so soft that the boom operators had to strain to catch it. "We'll be right back." As the cameras stopped rolling and the red recording lights went dark, the spell of the moment remained unbroken. The audience stayed standing. The Martinez family stayed together. And Steve Harvey, who had made a career out of making people laugh, found himself learning something new about the power of shared tears. During the extended break, something remarkable happened. Audience members began approaching the stage, not for autographs or photos, but to offer something more precious, their support. A woman pressed a business card into Carlos's hand, explaining she worked with a missing children's organization and had resources that might help. An elderly man hugged Rosa and promised to share Emily's photo with his church congregation of over 5. A young mother with tears in her eyes simply said to Maria, "I have a daughter Emily's age. I can't imagine, but I'll pray every day." A retired police officer approached Steve directly, offering to connect the family with specialized search teams that worked cold cases pro bono. The production assistants tried to maintain order, but Steve waved them off. "Let them," he said quietly to the floor manager. "This is bigger than television right now. This is what humanity looks like." Steve watched as his audience, strangers who had come to the studio expecting entertainment, transformed into a community of support around this grieving family. He saw business cards being exchanged, phone numbers written on scraps of paper, promises made and contact information shared. This was what television was supposed to do, he realized. Not just entertain, but connect. Not just distract, but inspire action. When they returned from the extended break, Steve made an unprecedented decision. Instead of continuing with the planned format, he turned the remaining time into something that had never happened in Family Feud history. A moment of pure human connection broadcast to millions. "Folks," he said, looking directly into the camera with an intensity that the viewing audience had never seen from him before, "we've been making television together for a lot of years. We've laughed together, we've played games together, we've had fun, but today we're going to do something different. Today we're going to be a family, a real family that looks out for each other." He paused, glancing back at the Martinez family, then continued. "Emily Martinez is 8 years old. She has dark hair, brown eyes, and the most beautiful smile you've ever seen. She's been missing for 3 years, but her family has never stopped believing she'll come home. And now, neither will we." 3 months later, Steve received a phone call that would change everything. Emily Martinez had been found, alive and safe, living with a woman who had convinced her that her family didn't want her anymore. A viewer in Oregon had recognized Emily from the show and called authorities. The woman, struggling with mental illness, had genuinely believed she was helping Emily, but Emily had never stopped believing in her family's love. Even when told that no one was looking for her, she had whispered her nighttime prayer every single night, "I love you to the moon and back, and around the sun, and through all the stars." When Emily was reunited with her family at the Portland police station, Steve was there. Not for cameras, not for publicity, but because somewhere along the way, this family had become part of his heart. When Emily saw him, she walked over and hugged his legs, just like his own children used to do.
"Thank you for helping them find me," she whispered.
"Sweetheart," Steve said, kneeling to her level. "You were never really lost. You were always in your family's hearts. Always." When Emily was reunited with her family, the first thing she said to her parents was, "I love you to the moon and back, and around the sun, and through all the stars." The follow-up episode, filmed 6 months later, showed the Martinez family complete once again. Emily, now taller and more serious but with the same bright eyes, sat beside the family podium. When Steve asked her what she wanted to tell other children who might be scared or lost, she stepped up to his microphone with surprising confidence. "If you're somewhere you don't want to be," she said, her young voice clear and strong, "remember that somebody loves you enough to never stop looking. And if grown-ups are watching, please remember faces. You might be the person who brings someone home." Some answers, Steve learned that day, are too beautiful for any game show board. Sometimes the most powerful thing television can do is simply stop being television and start being human. And sometimes the most important victories happen not when someone wins a game, but when love refuses to give up hope.